Welcome to A Canadian Investing in the US, a podcast and YouTube channel focused on Canadians buying real estate with host Glenn Sutherland.
Welcome to another episode of Canadian Investing in the U.S. This week, our guest is Diana Beatty. Diana, let's start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks, Glenn, and thanks for having me on your show. My husband and I are actually both originally from Ontario, but we've been living here in beautiful Victoria, British Columbia for the last 25 or so years. And we've been real estate investors since 2012. I will tell you that I've always had an interest in myself in real estate investing since I was young. My late father was always he knew it was a great idea, but never had the resources to get into it. But when I was 25 years old, I bought my first house on my own. And I just knew it was scary, but I knew that that was a smart thing to do as opposed to paying a landlord. Why would I do that when I could buy a house and the rent would be, comparable? Yep. And so that's what I did. I bought my first house when I was about 25. It was a little 800 square foot house in Hamilton, Ontario. And I didn't realize it at the time, but apparently I was house hacking because I rented out a room in my house to various young women just to help pay the rent. And I thought it was great. They were paying more than half my mortgage every month. And I just thought it was such a great idea. But then I sold that house when we moved out west. And so had a few years off. My husband and I bought our first house together when we were 97 here in Victoria in 1997. But then, life got busy. We had kids. We got married. We had kids, all that kind of stuff. We upgraded our house. But around 2008, of course, we all know what happened in the U.S. in 2008, the subprime crisis. And it sort of piqued my interest again because I knew there was tons of opportunity because we'd heard all about all this opportunity. And I started to, about 2009 or 10 or so, I started thinking to myself, I need to check into this. So I started self-educating, and one of the first books I picked up, of course, was Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which is a bit of a cliche, but there's a good reason for that. Yeah. And I read the book, and it just reinvigorated my idea that real estate was a good thing to do. And I handed it to my husband, and I said, you got to read this book because I think this is what we should be doing. And so he read it, and he gets it and understands it, but he kind of had his own gig going. So it's kind of been left up to me over the years, but he's on board, and I always joke that he was the one with the regular job so we could qualify for mortgages. Yeah. So, but anyways, I read that, and all of a sudden I thought, okay, I got to research. So I spent about the next 2 years reading books, self-educating, and then I thought I better read one done by a Canadian. So I ended up picking up Don Campbell's book. In fact, I have it here because I found it, Real Estate Investing in Canada. And the reason why I show this book is because this what really became my Bible for real estate investing, because it's a how-to book on how to invest in real estate. And but I did know that the U.S. market was I was particularly interested in Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Florida. But Phoenix stood out because Las Vegas, too much of a one-horse town with entertainment business, and Florida has too many natural disasters. So yeah. I just started talking to friends about it. And one of my friends said, hey, I have a friend who's a childhood friend who's a real estate agent in Phoenix. So that was kind of my in. And so I called this woman, and one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I was on a plane down to Phoenix. Of course, I mean, I say one thing led to another, but the reality is I knew it was a good idea. She worked with investors, so I got busy and booked a flight down there. But in the meantime, of course, started looking at lenders and all this other stuff to see what to do. Kind of like I heard you describe this, where you kind of do stuff first and then figure it out later. It was a little bit of that. And I got down there and looked at a ton of houses with her in a couple days, made offers on 3 and lost all of them because it was so competitive. If you weren't paying cash, which we weren't, we were going to finance, then you were losing out to cash buyers because home sellers or banks or whoever was selling was afraid that people would, back out of these deals. So anyway, I came home, kept making offers over the phone, and eventually the 7th offer was a charm. And we bought our first house in Glendale, Arizona. And so that worked out well. And of course, then the real education started. You know what that's like, trying to figure out escrow and HOAs and how to get an ITIN and all those things that came along with it. And but we did, and we got it. And a few months went by, and it all worked out well. And I said to my husband, we got to buy another one. So I flew back down again, and we ended up buying a house in Mesa. And same thing. And they were, it seemed like a no-brainer to me. With the houses were such a great deal back then, and that was 2012, by the way. And the first one we bought in 2012, the second one in 2013. And you have to keep in mind that money was at par. So I thought, how can we go wrong? So the first house, actually, the first one we bought, the Canadian dollar was worth more than the US dollar, if you can believe it. No. So that was sweet. But then the next time it was the other way around, but they were right around par.
Close, yeah.
So it was kind of like, how can we go wrong? We're able to buy these houses for $150,000 US, 3-bedroom new builds, like they were only a couple years old. And so that's what we did. And so we bought those and everything went well. And then, you know what happens, you get a contract working somewhere and your kids have stuff going on. And 3 more years passed and I started to get really itchy again about buying. And this time I thought I wanted to buy in Canada, just because I was watching, Money Sense magazine used to always publish this thing, the best places to invest in Canada for real estate.
Yep.
And Hamilton was one of the top places in Canada. And because I'd lived in Hamilton, I knew Hamilton. Yeah. I had a comfort level with it. So I started doing the research there and ended up finding a terrific real estate agent who worked with investors. And he was an investor himself and knew about REIN and all that. He was a member of REIN. And so anyways, we built a relationship, and then around Christmas of that year, which was 2015, he contacted me and said he had an off-market deal for 2 houses and was I interested in either one of them. And it was some guy who didn't really want to post stuff because he was trying to invest in Toronto. He wanted to unload them quickly, but it sounded good. But when I ran the numbers, it didn't work. The numbers didn't work. So I said, doesn't work. And he said, okay. And then 6 weeks later, he came back to me and said, the owner's getting more desperate now and has dropped the price $30,000 or $40,000. And then I did the math, and the math worked. So we ended up making an offer. It was accepted, sight unseen. And then I got on a plane and flew out to Hamilton and went through the house with a home inspector, which was a little more scary when it's a 100-year-old house as opposed to the ones in Phoenix.
Yeah.
And but we went through, and it was a 4-plex. So there was 4 units plus a garage that was also rented separately. And if you read Don Campbell's book, he always says, don't just let the tenants use the garage, rent it separately. So this was just use everything you can in the house. So we ended up buying it, and it did need some work right away. So we had some safety issues, but we ended up buying that house right away. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. And after we got that going, that one turned out to be a real honey because the market in Hamilton then just started to escalate because what was happening, Victoria really benefited from Vancouver. So all Vancouver properties were going up like crazy. And so everyone was fleeing to Victoria. So our values went up like crazy. And that's the same thing that was happening in Hamilton with Toronto. Yeah. Toronto, everyone was so we bought that house and it's increased in value greatly. We still own that house, and it's a great, it cash flows really well and has done really well for us. And we've put money in renovations into that since that time. And, but as far as buying other properties, we're looking at back to the US because, as you know, that's where the money makes sense. And so after we bought the one in Hamilton about 1.5 to 2 years ago, I started joining a bunch of real estate clubs here just to sort of get some ideas. And it was helpful, but nobody was investing in the US. Everyone's investing in Victoria, which my husband and I think is not a safe market. Everything is so crazy expensive here. We feel like it's putting too many eggs in one basket to put all your money into one property when you can put that same money into 4 or 5 properties in the US. So I started looking around for Canadians that were investing in the US, and that's actually how I came across your podcast.
Hey.
And I contacted you right away. You had just started. I think you only were 10 or 15 episodes in at the time, maybe. And
something like that, yeah.
I just was so happy to hear somebody talking about how to invest in the US because people here just didn't understand. And it is scary, but once you as you know, the more you do, the less scary it is. And so I found your podcast. And then also I found, I don't know, do you listen to Get Rich Education? Well, I highly recommend Keith Weinhold's Get Rich Education, and that was recommended to me by a turnkey seller in the U.S. And it's like I always liken it to it's like an AA group for real estate investors because it's every week you have a meeting, and it's motivating, and some of it's redundant, and some of it only applies to the US, but most of it you can apply to Canada as well. Just like Don Campbell's book, when I went to the US, to Phoenix, I actually had his property gold mine sheets on clipboards when I went around to houses, because you can apply it all to the US. It's just that there's a few different things that go on down there.
What have you got into now? What are you working on?
So that's a good question, because so after we bought the place in Hamilton, we always seem to need a couple of years to sort of, you know what it's like. The kids are doing stuff, and also when you do this, it's hard to do it off the side of your desk, as I'm sure you know. And in my previous lifetime, I was a photojournalist, a photographer, and I had a really robust freelance business, but then that kind of disappeared. And then over the years, I was working contracts with different things. And my husband used to joke every time I was between contracts, we'd buy another house, because when you're working and you've got kids, you come home, you don't have time to do too much stuff. But so now our children are older, so now we're looking again to buy more. And I'm really looking in the US again. We just actually, so last November, we bought a duplex in Ohio, in the greater Cleveland area. And that's probably been it's been a bit of a rough start because one of the units needed to be rehabbed. And then when it was finished, COVID had just hit. So it's been sitting empty for a while, which is a bit of a drag. But the other unit has been, we inherited the tenants, so that's been fine. Oh. And so we're just waiting for that one to get straightened out. And in the meantime, luckily, I'm sort of jumping all over here, but we also decided, one thing that Keith Weinhold talks about in his things is how you don't make any money off of equity. And so I knew it was time to sell one of our properties in Phoenix, even though it was still doing well. We had so much in equity, and it didn't make any sense to not turn that equity over. Like, we could turn the equity over into 3 properties elsewhere. So luckily we sold it, and it closed February the 26th, just before COVID struck. So now we have some money sitting in a bank account waiting to invest. So now we're looking in a lot of places that you are, like Alabama and Ohio a little bit. I think I'm going to venture a little more south, like where you are. Like, I'm looking at Birmingham, Huntsville, that kind of thing. And I'm probably looking at a turnkey this time, which I know might sound blasphemous to you, but
I started there.
Well, some of them are still a good deal. Like, they still are a good deal, even with the exchange. And if you're very careful, some of them still cash flow. So
you start cash flowing on day one too, and you're not going through that renovation. Right?
Exactly. And this last renovation in Cleveland, it just took so long. And I won't say I wouldn't do it again, but now I have been looking at a few turnkeys, but always keeping our eye open for something. But and then, despite the fact that we don't own any, other than our principal residence, we don't own any property here in British Columbia, but we are tossing around the idea of buying vacation property up island on Vancouver Island, and then we'd Airbnb it when we're not using it, because we have a really good ski hill here. So we'd like something in that area that we could use as a launch pad to ski. And in the summer, there's some great recreation up there, and we are talking about possibly doing that. So that would be a new venture, but that's something to sort of add to our own lifestyle.
Yeah. Cool. I was just thinking about this, but when you were starting investing in the States, how did you figure out all that stuff? The ITINs, figuring out if you were doing corporations. I don't know if you used that or not. Just did you get an accountant or how did you work your way through figuring all those things out?
Well, the real estate agent in Phoenix was extremely helpful. So first thing she did was give me the name of an excellent property manager who I still use to this day. So as you know, that's somebody you need on your team right away as a great property manager. She also is the one that told me not to, this sounds so simple to me now, but don't transfer your money across the border via a bank, because they give you a crappy exchange rate. So she recommended that I go with a trust company, which we did. And that probably saved us about $2 or $3 grand right off the exchange when we not so much the first time because money was at par, but more but they took such a spread.
You'd be paying either way.
And then fortunately, believe it or not, we have an accountant in Victoria who does Canadian and US taxes. So we kept them sort of as a proprietorship up until actually about a year ago. And that's one of the things I contacted you about. You recommended that we get a limited partnership because I didn't know to get an LLC or an LP or what to do. But my husband and I just started an LP in the US last year, and then we transferred all our homes over into that. Yep. And then we bought our most recent property in Ohio right away with our LP.
Cool.
But and the ITIN and stuff was just simply things that our accountants and such would tell us. But one interesting aside to switching your stuff into a LP was that when we sold the house in Phoenix this year, we tried to get a bank account at the Bank of America, which we've had accounts at since 2012, a business account. They wouldn't give us one. I begged them, I pleaded them. We were down in the US, wouldn't do it.
Really?
So when we sold the house in Phoenix, the title company had a check in the name of our LP. And I said, we don't have a bank account for our LP. And she said, we're not giving you your money. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. Yeah. So we were about to get a big check, and she's saying, yeah, there's so much wire fraud, we can't possibly give it to you. And I said, well, I can prove to you that my husband and I are the only partners in this LP. And she said, doesn't matter, won't do it. So we were in a situation where the Bank of America wouldn't give us a business account. And then that trust company that we have, I called him up and I said, we need a bank account in the name of our business, our LP. Will you give us one? Like an account. And he's like, sure. And he turned that around for me in like 4 hours. And so all of a sudden we had a account, because otherwise we would still not have the money today, because I don't know how we would have gotten it. So unfortunately it's sitting in an account with no interest, but what do you do? At least it's in our name. And I could transfer it now to our Bank of America account. But it's just one of those funny things that you think it's a no-brainer, that why wouldn't a bank give you, we've been down there for so long, but as you know, they have funny rules when it comes to foreign nationals.
Oh, yeah, I've went through the same thing. Sometimes it's just like I haven't even got all my paperwork yet for an LP, and you bought a property and because I always send extra money, and they cut you a check back for the extra, and you're like, I don't have a bank account for this yet because I haven't got an EIN number, so I can't set up a bank account. And they're like, well, this check's good for 60 days. You're like, clock is ticking, we need a bank account.
So how are you getting bank accounts then in the U.S.?
So originally I was doing it through Royal Bank. I liked using them because I could do it all through email. They would set it all up. I thought I had troubles with them, and I tried switching to TD. TD would set up personal accounts in Canada, and they wouldn't do anything over email. So in order to get business accounts, I'd have to go to a TD, and there's none close. Like Niagara Falls, New York doesn't have any. Buffalo doesn't have any. It's like you have to go way in there. So I was like, okay, that doesn't work. And the funny thing is, I switched all my stuff mostly to Progress Bank, which is a bank in Huntsville, Alabama. And the reason is I found on some of the properties I was buying that were really cheap, they were the lender on the properties. So I wanted to get a relationship with them because they'll loan on like $40,000 properties, whereas a lot of banks won't loan on those properties. So I wanted to build a relationship with them. So I'm like, let's set up some bank accounts. Let's show money going in and out, and build a relationship, and hopefully they will give me a loan at some point. But right now they don't have a foreign national program, so there's nothing for me. But
did you have to be in the bank to do that, or could you do it from Canada?
That's one of the reasons I switched there. I do everything through email. They just changed their policy, though, that they want everything notarized, which is a pain. But they'll accept a Canadian notary, but it's still a pain. Before it was so much easier just to fill out a form and send it back to them. But that's basically what I'm doing there. I have a question for you, because you mentioned you're doing a trust company to send the money. I haven't done that, and I've heard that from a couple of people that's actually even cheaper than the way I've been sending money. What's the process, and how are you doing that?
I use Olympia Trust. Yeah. So it's really easy, actually. You just call a contact there and tell them you want to move money across the border, and then you have to do the usual things. They're always checking for money laundering and that kind of stuff. So you have to show all that stuff in your ID. And then once you build a relationship with them, like now it's great. I just call them up and say, like when I needed that account for our LP, it was incredible how quickly they were able to act. And the thing about trust companies that is really good, as opposed to some other companies, like I know you use Knightsbridge, and and I'm sure they're great, but the stuff in a trust company is backed up by Canadian government. So if they go out of business, your money is insured, whereas places like Knightsbridge, it's not. And we had a case in Victoria here where one of our currency houses went under earlier this year. And a friend of ours had just transferred 40 grand into it and he lost it because there's no insurance on it. So that's one thing nice about using a trust company that makes it a little more secure. And they have great protocols. When we bought our second house in Phoenix, a few months later, so we bought that. A few months later, my guy at the trust company called me and said, Diana, if you want to get that money to England today, you've got to get it in your account. And I'm saying, what are you talking about? And it turned out someone had hacked my email to him and were trying to get money out of my account. Yeah, which was scary, except that I didn't have any money in the account. And also he said we would have never done it. So then we did a little fun thing where he called the guy, he wrote the guy and said, I need to talk to you on the phone. And he's like, oh no, I can't talk right now, but it's okay. Just go through and do it. And he's like, no. So the guy, it was a scam, but they had good protocols in place so that couldn't happen, because that kind of was very scary. And that was back in 2013 that happened. So now it's so much, the scammers are even better now.
Cool. Yeah. Tell me something about Arizona, because I'm still like, I hear a lot of people are, I've heard lots of stuff about Cleveland, but only had a couple guests who do the Arizona. I have had a few though. What's Arizona like? What kind of tenants are you getting?
Well, Arizona is great. And honestly, I wish we had bought 20 houses back when it happened, because now it's very hard to have anything cash flow there. The market has gone up and appreciated so much. But what I really liked about it when we first were looking there was it's got such a diverse economy. I mean, it's got an Air Force base, it's got pro sports teams, it's got spring training, it's got all sorts of medical facilities. And it's huge too. It takes like an hour and a half to go from one end of Greater Phoenix to the other. And it's a lot of people want to live there because the weather it's warm all year long. I'd love to buy there again, but there's no opportunity there right now. So but I love the houses we had there, and I would have loved to have kept it, but I kept hearing Keith Weinhold say, how much do you make off of equity? Zero. And he's right. So they were still cash flowing, but we had all this equity sitting in the house. So we decided to bail it out and transfer it over. So and now we're just waiting with the COVID thing before we make any. I'm not worried about COVID. I'm quite bullish still on real estate, but we have 2 vacant units right now. So I'm just waiting till they fill, and then I'll go forward.
Yep, I totally understand what you're talking about there. My Canadian properties, they basically doubled in price. The ones here outside of an hour and a half from Toronto, and everyone was like, "Why are you selling them? Why don't you refi?" And I'm like, "If I refi, they don't really cash flow. Like, there's no point. They cash flow really nice, but there's so much equity. It's a catch-22, right?" And that's why I was going into sale mode, and I started selling them off because I could do much better in other markets, and it makes more sense to move my money around. Same thing, exactly. It's just the Canadian market does this same thing. Anytime there's a huge amount of appreciation in a market, it's like, what is your return on the equity that's stuck in that property? It doesn't make sense to keep that. Even, I like to refi, and even with some of my American properties, but you're like, sometimes if you refi, they don't cash flow anymore because it's went up too much in value.
Yeah, and that's exactly too, like our principal residence here in Victoria, the market here is so insane. We joke now that we live in a house that we could never afford to buy. But what that means is we have a lot of equity to parlay into real estate, which is one of the main reasons why we've been able to do this. And of course, we have lots of friends who they know what we're doing, and some of them just think we're crazy because they say, I know you do this, but we're risk adverse and we could never do that. And I say, well, we have 4 mortgages and we're only responsible for paying one of them. So for me, I don't really consider that risky. And I said, and I said, I can't imagine any situation in which all of our tenants wouldn't be able to pay their rent. Yep. And what just bit me in the butt on that? COVID-19. When COVID happened, that first month, as I'm sure you did, we just held our breath. We had no idea who was going to pay and who didn't. And I don't know if did you have any problems at your end?
I didn't have any new problems. I had some tenants who were already a problem, and they were still a problem. But nothing new came out of the COVID. But I was the same way. I freaked out. I called all my note servicing companies, and I'm like, what's the plan if things go bad? I'm like, I got enough money to pay you for like 6 months, but if this thing goes longer and I don't get any rent, we're in trouble, right? Like, what's the plan here? And I called my Canadian mortgage companies too. I'm like, what's the plan? But I never actually took any of the plans, the alternate plans. I didn't want to take any of that. I read some stuff on taking money from the Canadian banks too. It doesn't work out in your favor.
No, I agree. And we only had one tenant, our one tenant in Phoenix. The first month, April, yeah, they were 15 days late, but they paid. And then May 1st, they told our property manager that they wouldn't be able to pay. And they've been good tenants. They've been there for 2.5 years. They paid every month, and they've taken good care of the place. So I was like, okay, well, what are we going to do? And then on the 15th, or halfway through the month, my property manager contacted me and said they walked away. They packed up, left, and handed over the keys. And you know what? I'm not angry about that. I feel I wish them the best. They did us a favor, because we wouldn't have been able to evict, and we wouldn't have evicted them, by the way, because that's not the way we roll, and they'd been good tenants. But they knew they couldn't pay, so they got out. And how can we complain about that? So now that place is just it's rent ready, and it's on the market. And unfortunately, Phoenix is such a hopping market. My property manager says he expects it to be rented like any day. So it just went on yesterday, I think. Yeah. So
it amazes me. Like, a lot of this, except for my Indianapolis properties, everything else, it rents up really, really fast. And I was really shocked by that, especially some of the places like Dayton and stuff that I wasn't thinking that would have the big draw for. We're still doing renovation, and some of them, the property manager's saying, yeah, we have people lined up who want to go see the property before it's done being renovated to move in. I was like, that's incredible. That's incredible.
I wish that was the case with us in Cleveland. I'm not disappointed that we bought the property, but the property manager has been a real disappointment. And I know that COVID is happening, but we'll now we have 2 other units. One rented right away, and the one in Hamilton came open, and it was rented right away. And the people moved out on the same day the new people moved in, kind of thing. And then the one in Phoenix is going to rent right away, and this one in Cleveland just sits. And I'm not impressed with the property manager, and as soon as I can, I will be moving that to somebody else, because it's been a real disappointment. But it's part of the learning process. So, and Cleveland, it's tough to find good property management in Cleveland, and I knew that going in, but I thought I had somebody that I could rely on. And I think that if everything is occupied, they're fine, but I'm not sure. So that's a good learning. I'm not going to buy again in that area for a while until I can have a good stable property manager.
Yeah, it's growing pains. Every time I switch markets, you have to go through it. And it's tough when you keep switching markets. We have
a good property manager in Phoenix. We're very pleased with him. We've had him since 2012. But one thing we realized is he was putting a lockbox on the property and allowing people to go in, and that's not cool with us. So our real estate agent that helped us purchase the homes, she recommended the property manager, and she works with him sometimes on leasing. So now what we do is we have her do the leasing for us, and it might cost us another $200, but she's better at picking tenants than he is. And that's because she meets them in person, and she knows. The last tenant he picked was a bit of a jerk, and I guess he ticked off the neighbors because the HOA was coming around and fining him constantly, like for everything, garbage pails, weeds, everything. And so our property manager said, well, he's a jerk, and the neighbors are getting back at him. Well, that was a pain for us. So after that, I started so that's an idea you could try. If you could have a real estate agent that you trust that does leasing, have them work in conjunction with your property manager. And if the property manager does everything great except that, then you can just use something. It might cost you a little bit more, but I think it's worked well for us, and that's what we do there. You can't get a refi right now because our property in Ohio, we bought it with cash and we want to refinance it. We can't get anybody to refinance it so if you know anybody, let me know. Because of COVID, I think they're just closed everything down for a while.
They're reopening right now, depending on which lenders you use. What kind of price point? Because I know Cleveland's really low.
It'll be in the 140 range.
Oh yeah, easily. You can easily get lending right now.
Okay, maybe we can talk off.
We'll talk off screen. Yeah.
Well, I do have a good guy, but right now he's only doing mortgages because so many people are trying to take advantage. are taking advantage of this time. There's going to be opportunity, right? Like,
Yep.
Nobody's wishing anybody bad. I actually think more than anything, a lot of landlords are going to be spooked by this, and they're going to bail. And so there will be opportunities. So I don't know if you've talked about that yet. About, are you waiting to see what happens, or are you just plowing through?
I'm plowing through. I didn't stop at all. I actually, in like 2020, I've been going harder than I've ever went in my life before. I don't even know how many properties we bought this year, but we bought a lot. And
anybody can do this. But you just have to be willing to put the work in and educate yourself. And you don't have to go to KeySpar or anything like that. Not that I'm dissing those, because they're great. But I did all my research reading books. And now, of course, podcasts weren't as big of a thing back when I started. But and literally, you can almost read one book like this and get everything you need to know. It gives it, as long as you treat it like, okay, I got to take this seriously, and everything that he says I got to do. I can't say, I don't want to be bothered with that. And but it is hard to do off the side of your desk. And my husband always says that we could never do this if I had a full-time job. We couldn't do it. And I was always freelancing or doing contracts, so it kind of dovetailed pretty well.
Yeah, no, you're preaching to the choir. I read a book every month. You have
a book club.
I have the book club. And but I've been doing it for years. I read one book every month. Mostly do audiobooks so I can do it while I'm driving. And when I used to have the job where I drove around, I used to listen to about 4 hours of podcasts every single day. So you can plow through a lot of information. So it's the free way to do it, but it takes a lot more time. And I think that's why people do the KeySpy or the other things, is to shortcut it. But a lot of people, like you said, even yourself, when you had 2 years where you're figuring it all out, just do some homework yourself. And a lot of these times, if you go pay for these courses, they're just regurgitating the same stuff in a book. They haven't come up with a new system. There's only so many different things that people are doing, right? There's, the lease options, the subject to, regular real estate stuff. There's just you just get one of the books for each of the kind of things and try and really understand each topic, and you're good, right? You'll learn as you go. If you have that mentality to just jump in, figure out the details as you go, or partner with someone. I always say partner with somebody now.
Yeah, and you could partner with somebody too, but if you're, if there's one thing that I want people maybe to think of today is that, like, again, I'm not one of your guests that has a huge amount of experience, but that anybody can do this. We're just Jane and John Doe out here in Victoria, right? And anybody can do this, but you just have to be willing to put the work in and give yourself an education. Again, you don't have to spend 10 grand, just figure it out. Join real estate groups, which I've done here in town. They're not always great meetings, but sometimes they're better than others, but I always get some information out of them. And if I get one thing that's worth it for me. And so I would just say that you can do it. And one way you can do it too is the real estate agent we had in Phoenix, because she already worked with investors and Canadian. She is Canadian. She's actually from Victoria. So she knew all the things we had to do. So she's the one that told me about using the cross-border trust company. And she's the one that knew a property manager. So this was things early on, right, that really helped me out. She also knew lenders as well. And I can't remember if it was one of the lenders I found or her, it doesn't matter. But anyways, so if you get a good real estate agent that deals with investors, my guy in Hamilton is the same way. He deals with investors. So he can help, if you want to go Canadian, he can hold your hand a bit and help you with that. He also gave me a great property manager, ex-cop, great guy. And we still use him to this day. So you can get information from people like that, in addition to listening to podcasts and stuff. Just be careful when somebody's trying to sell you something. Yep. That's all I would say is, you should always have a healthy bit of skepticism or know that, what's behind the curtain that they're trying to sell you.
Verify.
Yeah. And even some of these turnkey companies, some of them, I listen to their stuff and I get a feel for them, whether they're legit or not. So,
Yep. Yeah. No, I think, some of them will sell you a property for higher than the market value because you don't know any better. And it sounds like you're a deal. It sounds like a deal because you're from an expensive market. So.
Yeah. And they always make everything work for the 1% rule. Like it's always right around the 1% rule. So a lot of people think, oh, it's a good deal. Well, you still have to run the numbers. And the nice thing about the numbers in the US is that they are always often better, and things like taxes and stuff are so much lower. And renos, I'm sure you know that too. The renos are way cheaper in the US.
Way cheaper.
Yeah, I'll tell a funny story. When we first bought one of our houses in Phoenix, and because we live in Victoria, so everything here is, if you think it's expensive in Ontario, you should come here. But so we got a notice from our property manager that one of the tenants said that 2 taps were leaking. And so they had to call in a plumber, and we're like, oh God, here we go.
Oh no.
And so he comes back and he says, yeah, so unfortunately the carburetor was shot. So you need a new carburetor. They had to change out the taps in both places. And I was like, oh God, here we go. I said, how much is it? He goes, $268. And I was like, I almost laughed. I said to him, if that were Victoria, that would be a $1,200 job. So I said, go ahead and do it. Like, I couldn't believe the difference in pricing. So, you know, that's what.
If we're going to go on a pricing thing, one of the biggest reasons we let our last property manager go in Indianapolis is they charged us $120 to replace a toilet seat. And we're like, yeah, you're done. We're like, first, reverse this fee. And they're like, we can't. We hired a plumber or something to do it. And we're like, what? And we're like, plumber. You obviously don't know what you're doing. We're switching again. And this was a highly recommended company by several people in Canada that do big time investing. And we're just like, how are you making it work with these guys? Because I can't see that it makes any sense.
Yeah, you don't want to get into that. And they're just lining their pockets.
Oh. Yeah.
So.
And they also charge 10% extra on every bill that they get anyone else to do. And they're like, we're not getting rich. And I'm like, you get rich when we get rich. I'm like, that's not the case. That's not the case.
Well, one of my property managers, it's actually the one in Hamilton. I can tell the story because the guy's not there anymore. But we had to put in new steps out front, and that was expensive because you had to put cement and all that. It was it was quite expensive. And I think it was going to be $8,000. And I said, well, what's your fee? Do you have a fee that you charge me? And he goes, yeah, it's 25%. I said, no, you got to be joking. I said, no. And he said, no, it's 25%. And he was their guy. And so I said, okay, thank you. No, thanks. And so I just did it by phone. I was able to get somebody, whatever, on the phone. But anyways, later on, that was the construction guy or an office person they hired. But anyways, I later talked to the property manager, actually just recently, and I told him that story, and he was like, oh my God, we would have never charged you that. And I said, yeah, because like if you're charging 25%, I'm going elsewhere. Like I can work phones. I don't need you. And he's like, no, we would have never done that. He said, yes, we would charge a fee, of course, because they have to meet them there and stuff like that. But yeah.
Charging 25% or even charging 10%, well, 25% for sure, they're probably making just as much or more than the guys actually doing the concrete work.
Well, yeah, and on an $8,000 job, that's $2,000. Like, I don't think so. And I was just like, no. And so anyways, whatever.
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
So, Diana, if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do so?
Well, I can just give you my email after the show, and maybe you can just put it in the show notes, and they can feel free to contact me if they just want to even just have some moral support or one of the hardest things I think when you're doing this is analysis paralysis and making that jump and that decision to do it. And sometimes you just got to get on the plane and go, and it's hard, but as soon as you do it, it gets easier. But sometimes you just have to get over that hump. And there's been times when you do stuff and I remember when we bought the house in Hamilton, like sight unseen. By the way, we never saw either of the houses in Phoenix either. You have a home inspector and a real estate agent you trust. You don't need to, but when we bought the place in Hamilton, I remember that night I went to bed and had a full-fledged panic attack because I thought, what have I done? Am I crazy? Was I crazy? And I got Don Campbell's book out, and there's something in it that says you've just bought the place and now you're freaking out. What do you do? And what he said to do was trust the math, trust the numbers. Instead of freaking out, just sit down and do the math. And if the math works, trust the math. And that's when I start freaking out about anything, I trust the math.
That is a great tip. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. This was actually a really fun chat.
Oh, good. Thanks for having me. It is fun.